If you ever heard someone say, don't shoot log in low light, it's too noisy, I get it. That's something that I also believed in the beginning until I actually tried it and learned what log actually does. And since then, I always shoot log, no matter if it's dark or bright, even at ISO 12800. And honestly, the results are way better than you might think. And in my opinion, better than not shooting log at all. So let me show you a few examples in case you don't believe me. Here are a few shots color graded from S-Log 3 at ISO 12800 I took at night during a hike up Mount Rinjani summit in Indonesia. So there was barely any light, and as you can see, they look perfectly fine and show about as much noise after color grading as a normal picture profile would. And I didn't even apply any denoising here, and it would already be totally usable. If I do that, if I apply denoising, it looks like this. Perfectly clean. Now, to be honest, log straight out of camera often does look a bit noisy, but once it's graded properly, most of that and oftentimes all of it disappears. So in this video, I'm going to show you exactly why that happens and why people say shooting log in low light is bad and why that's actually not true. You will also learn how to shoot log at night the right way, so you will always get the best image your camera setup can produce under these conditions. And this video is sponsored by Neat Video, which is a super helpful tool for the few shots where it's just not possible to avoid noise with or without log. I will tell you more about that later in this video. Alright, let me explain what's actually going on when people say log is too noisy at night, because your camera sensor can essentially capture a certain amount of dynamic range, which I show you here in that graphic, and on most mirrorless cameras it's something like 13 to 14 total stops. That includes the cleanest highlights all the way down to the darkest shadows and even the areas that are basically unusable because of noise. And now when you shoot in log, you're capturing that entire 13 to 14 stop range. You get everything the sensor sees, which also means you're gonna see some of that noise down in the shadows, especially if you're underexposed, which by the way is called the noise floor. And that's where people usually freak out, but here's the thing, that's not a log problem, it's just showing you everything the sensor can capture, which is exactly what log is supposed to do and what you want for the best image. And now compare that to a standard picture profile like PP off, Cine 2, Fuji's film simulations, or whatever you normally use, because those only capture around 9 stops of dynamic range. So basically, instead of recording everything the sensor sees, they just take a slice out of that 14 stop range, and this is where it gets interesting. If you're underexposing, that 9 stop slice moves down into the shadow area closer to the noise floor, and then even those standard picture profiles will show lots of noise while also clipping the highlights, and the amount of noise is usually very similar to a color graded log profile at the same exposure, because again, noise comes from the sensor and not from the picture profile. And if you try to expose brighter, either for the highlights or to clean the shadows up from the noise, you run into a different problem. Your 9-star picture profile window starts cutting off the shadows, so that information is gone entirely, what oftentimes looks quite bad, at least in the shadows. So with those baked in picture profiles, you're always compromising, because you're either losing highlight detail and get a noisy image, or you're losing shadow detail just to avoid a bit of noise in the shadows, which would likely disappear during the color grade anyway, and if not, is very easy to remove. So that's why there is actually no reason, in my opinion, not to shoot log in low light. Log profiles make highlight clipping less likely because they capture the full dynamic range, and you can decide later in post how to balance the image in terms of shadow noise. But honestly, most of the time, most of the noise disappears into the blacks anyway during color grading, as mentioned already, and if there is still a bit too much noise left, it's quite easy to clean up and you will still end up with more usable detail than any baked-in profile could give you. So yeah, log might look noisier out of the box, but it gives you a way better image. You're not just seeing more noise, you're just seeing more of your image, and that's always a good thing. But of course, the results depend on how you shoot, so let's talk about how to actually shoot log properly in low light, because yes, there is a right, or let's say a best way to do it. Now, when it comes to shooting in low light, the most important thing to understand is that the darker it gets, the brighter you should expose if possible, but that does not mean cranking up your ISO right away. Instead, raising ISO should actually be the last step. Before that, your job is to get as much light onto the sensor as possible. So first, keep your frame rate low and lower your shutter speed. Ideally, you would, for example, shoot in 24 or 25 frames per second at a shutter speed of 1/48 or 1/50. Or if you shoot in 30 frames per second, you would set your shutter to 1/60, so basically 180-degree shutter rule. And if the shot has barely any movement, you can even go slower, like 1/30, to let even more light onto the sensor. But be careful with that, because motion can start looking weird, so that's only for very, very still shots. And next, you should open your aperture all the way, and that means that you should set your lens to the lowest f-stop possible, ideally f1.2, 1.4 or 1.8, but if that's not possible, choose whatever your lens gives you or choose another lens with a lower f-stop. That's also a big reason why I always have at least one f1.4 or lower lens with me, so I can get great low light shots and of course lots of bokeh. And such lenses mustn't be expensive. Viltrox, Sirui and Sigma, for example, offer pretty affordable ones. So, low shutter speed and aperture is very important, because that gives you the biggest jump in brightness before you even touch ISO. And then once you've done all that, you can start raising the ISO if you have to, because your image could already be bright enough. If not, just raise it until your image looks good on your screen. There is one more part though, which most people don't understand at the beginning of shooting log, and that is that modern mirrorless cameras often have what's called two base ISOs for log shooting, and this is also where it gets pretty interesting. Many cameras don't even let you shoot below the first base ISO, so for example, if it's 800, you can't even set the camera to 100 or other lower ISOs, and that's correct and totally fine, because that's the ISO where the camera gives you the best image and most dynamic range overall, so don't be scared of that, it's not an error. Some cameras do let you choose ISO levels below that, but they give you some indicators in the ISO menu telling you that it's below base. In that case, I would always stick to base ISO, because you get a better image there. But actually where it gets interesting for us is the second base ISO, and that's more interesting because let's say your second base ISO is 3200, and if you then shoot at ISO 2000 instead, you will actually get more noise than if you just bumped it up to 3200. That's because that second base ISO is where the sensor switches into a different mode and the signal gets amplified more cleanly. So even though the ISO number looks higher, the image actually gets cleaner. That's why that's the base ISO you want to hit if you're in low light, and then you can go higher from there if needed. Now, finding your base ISOs can be a bit tricky because manufacturers usually don't state it, but the first base ISO is very easy to find because your camera, as mentioned before, indicates it or doesn't even let you shoot lower. And for the second base ISO, just Google yours or check Gerald Undern's videos, because he has done the homework on pretty much every camera. Now, once you pass that second base ISO, raising ISO basically becomes the same as brightening the image during the color grade, but I still prefer to do it in camera because I get a better preview of how it's gonna look. I can check the focus more easily on the screen, and some cameras actually preserve more color data when you expose properly in camera via ISO, because they read a 12 or 14-bit image from the sensor, which is better compared to lifting it later in post from a highly compressed 10-bit file. And newer cameras handle color at high ISOs really well anyway, so if you expose properly, you will be surprised how clean and usable log looks at night. So just make sure to make your image as bright as possible before raising the ISO, and you're fine shooting log in low light. Honestly, you would have to do the same for normal picture profiles as well to get the best image, so log actually doesn't change much here despite having to be aware of base ISOs. Alright, so you've shot your log footage properly, but depending on the shot, you might still see a bit of noise in the flat log image, but the moment you convert that log image to Rec 709 for SDR or Rec 2020 for HDR, boom, the shadows get darker, contrast comes back, and in most cases the noise either disappears or is so low that it's perfectly usable, like in that shot here. Of course, there are a few cases where it might still be a bit much, but if that happens, you can still add noise reduction, which is oftentimes built into your video editor. Especially DaVinci Resolve has pretty good noise reduction built in, but if you want something cleaner, especially if you're working in Final Cut or other apps where the inbuilt noise reduction is not that good, Neat Video gives you the best noise reduction I've ever seen out there. And they just released version 6, which is honestly a big upgrade. It's up to 2 times faster while using up to 2 times less memory. It's well optimized for modern GPUs and even works better with HDR footage now. And what's cool is it doesn't just blur the noise, it actually analyzes the image and removes the noise patterns while keeping detail in place, so you're not destroying your image just to make it look clean. Using it is super easy and quick. You just apply to the clip, click the button to open its window, click Auto Profile to automatically select a suitable area to create the noise profile, click Apply in the bottom right corner, and the noise is gone. You can also use it to deflicker footage or remove dust and scratches, which is super useful if those issues are present in your shots. And these, in my opinion, are not just extras, they are essential tools whenever you need them, because we all mess it up sometimes, that something is flickering or that maybe our sensor is not clean or so. But I mostly use it just for regular noise cleanups, and I found just using the auto function works great. It gives me clean results in just a few seconds, no tweaking needed most of the time. I usually just apply it towards the end of the color grade when everything is done on shots where there's still a bit too much noise, as the playback can still lag a bit after applying it, just like with all other noise reduction tools, and that's it. Quick render, done. Looks way better, no color smearing, and you still get the full benefit of shooting log. So if you're looking for a fantastic noise reduction plugin, check out Neat Video. You will find the link in the description below. And that's it for the color grade. Even if some shots look a bit rough straight out of camera, just trust the process, because once it's graded and some shots eventually cleaned up properly, it will usually look miles better than anything baked in. So by now you already know some solid reasons to shoot log, even in low light. You get more dynamic range, more flexibility, and once it's graded properly, the noise just isn't a real problem anymore. But there is more to it than that. The biggest reason for me is actually workflow consistency, because when you shoot log, you don't need to change anything when it gets dark. Same profile during the day, same profile during the night, same LUTs, same color space transforms, same grading approach. That just keeps everything clean and simple in post, especially when you're color grading under time pressure. And then there's also future proofing, like even if you're just exporting in Rec 709 right now, shooting log means you've got everything you need for HDR or higher end delivery later. And honestly, once you got used to having all that data, going back feels super limiting. And if you're still thinking, yeah, but shooting log is hard, I can tell you it's actually not. I made a whole video which you can watch here called Log is Now on Easy Mode that shows you how simple it's become even for beginners. So if you haven't watched that yet, definitely check it out next. Link is also in the description if it doesn't show up. So yeah, just shoot log even at night. It's not only totally doable, it's actually better.